Welcome to this episode of the Local Earth Discussion Series. We are grateful to be bringing you information about visionary solutions for the planet and regenerative community development. We are a nonprofit organization that operates primarily on contributions from our Patreon members and donations. If you appreciate the information shared in these discussions, please consider becoming a Local Earth Patreon member. A link to the membership information is shared in the description below. This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Solar Energy Alliance. There is a link in the description below for a free solar proposal for your home and information about how to become a partner or ambassador with the Alliance. We now invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of the Local Earth Discussion Series. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Local Earth Discussion Series. My name is Joshua Alvord, and this episode is focused on visionary solutions with Forrest Landry. Thank you so much for being here, Forrest.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.
First met you, Forrest, a few years back when Shiloh and Davin were doing the Designing the New World workshop series. And you and Daniel Schmachtenberger came in to do kind of a featured presentation.
Yeah, I remember that.
And just hearing you speak, just with the wisdom and intelligence you had to share, and the humbleness and the genuineness from where you share from, I just really appreciated that. And it's been a real honor to get to know you over these last couple of years at different events. And
Thank you. You're welcome.
Yeah, real pleasure to have you here. So I will go through an introduction here to Forrest, and then we can start our discussion. Forrest's central interest is developing adequate capacities for collective discernment, sense-making, choice-making, and collective action in service to coordinated, long-term, conscious, sustainable evolution. Near term, these capabilities are applied in the areas of X-risk, community, and civilization, inclusive of social process design, governance, values discovery, and the commons, so as to enable movement towards a world commensurate with the higher ideals and potentials of humanity. Forrest has a broad educational background in the natural sciences, social sciences, practical craft, and philosophy, with an emphasis in the epistemics needed to better approach wicked problems, and the ethical considerations to inform the design criteria for adequate solutions. Forrest has participated in projects to survey the landscape of existential and catastrophic risks, advance forecasting and mitigation strategies, and develop capacities for the kinds of multi-agent coordination needed to implement sufficient solutions. Associated work has been done to develop models of how to identify fundamental contributors to civilizational collapse process, institutional decay, social corruption, etc., insofar as they are useful in both scenario planning and in the design of more resilient processes and systems. So, we're focusing on solutions. Let's just start the discussion here. Where do we start from this moment on, in present day, new year 2020? Where do we start?
Well, once you have a characterization of the problem, so let's assume that we have a characterization of the problem, and we can go into talking about various ways of characterizing it. One of the things we want to do is to think about the design of the solution as effectively being something that is both answerable to our values, but also to the needs of the world in an actual just physical sense. Like, it has to be possible to implement the solution. So we're looking at a kind of practical basis on one hand, and a kind of values basis on another, and then a sort of theoretic connection back to what the problems were. So in other words, we kind of sit in the triangle of thinking about design from a what can we do? Like, when we're thinking about how to do something, we're thinking about, why we're doing it, what it is, and how to do it, right? So there's kind of a triangle there of different considerations that are defining the constraints on what an adequate and comprehensive solution would actually look like. So when we say, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions, we're saying, okay, well, what are the kinds of things that we would need to be thinking about to understand what success looks like? Like how would we identify it? What would it look like? What would it feel like? How do we know it's a good solution? What kinds of things are our capabilities that effectively can be part of the reason that we develop this solution this way, because it plays to our strengths rather than to our weaknesses. So there's a lot of factors involved. And so in one sense, to think about design in a kind of comprehensive sense is to essentially look at all of these factors in kind of an organized way. So that's sort of the next step. And so when we get to, how do we think about solutions? How do we think about success in this? Part of it is literally conversations like this one, where we're doing sense making around how to do good design. So there's a kind of social brainstorming process. So in my mind, a lot of that comes down to, we're good at thinking about design in terms of small teams, but we're not good at thinking about design in terms of communities. So I got really interested in this problem of how do we do brainstorming at a collective level? Like if we had a community of say, 300 people who were either direct stakeholders in a particular situation or had deep knowledge, interest in topics like that, how to essentially coordinate a design process that involves a lot of people. And you notice that I'm speaking about it as a kind of design rather than as a kind of politics. Usually with like a representative system, we kind of take and we say, okay, these people are experts, we're going to have them figure it out, and then we're just going to do whatever they say. And so, we can get into, identifying who those electives are and what expertise they might have and whether or not their motivations are actually lined up with the value systems that I'm connected to and so on and so forth. Whereas in this particular case, I'm thinking more in terms of a kind of direct democracy or a kind of direct engagement in design process, not so much to select between pre-chosen alternatives, but to essentially identify what the field of solutions look like and what the field of design capabilities are, and how to essentially match the skills and resources and capabilities we have to the deep nature of the problem in a very clear and straightforward way.
So it was funny. For some reason, our connection got a little bit cut off for like a couple seconds, and it was right when you said the number of, like, let's say we're in a community, like not in a community, but in like a town, and you said a number of people. And how many people did you say?
Well, a small number of hundreds would be ideal.
Okay.
So in other words, if you want to have at least a pretty wide variety of opinions and perspectives and things like that. You want the group to have enough diversity across the sheer number of specialties that would be involved, or the sheer complexity of the issue. Again, it's kind of like what the ideal is in this case. If we're working with towns or cities that have thousands or millions of people in them, then of course, we're going to want to look at extensions of this technique. But if we're looking at groups that are too small, then individual dynamics end up dominating the overall phenomena. So I'm trying to find groups of a few hundred to think about in this sense.
And so I don't think in this discussion we've named it yet, the ephemeral group process.
Yeah.
And that's what you're speaking to, correct?
Yeah. So essentially, after asking questions like this, really trying to take into account some of the very deep things about how our bodies and nervous systems work, the kind of biases we have in communication with one another, sort of long-term history of us as a species that influence how we relate to one another. So we're a social species, and so in effect, trying to think about how do we do brainstorming at scale, how do we do design at scale, then in effect, it's not that we're designing for scale, we're designing within scale. So there's a kind of need to account for kind of the anthropology of human beings in order to come up with good technique in this space. So ephemeral group process is essentially the results of my thinking on this as a kind of experimental basis to explore the space of how do we do good sense making together. So if we're looking at a problem that requires some sort of collective action, like if we're building a bridge or we're basically changing something that requires a lot of people to participate, like the space program, for example. I mean, if you look at what it took to get a man onto the moon, that required the coordinated efforts of essentially, hundreds of different groups of people. And so, again, for a lot of the kind of problems that we're looking at, things like climate issues and ecological issues, species, die off because of ecosystem collapse and things like that. There's a need for us to really think about it in a very broad-based way. If we're going to actually solve problems like how to preserve the rainforest, for example, how to preserve coral reefs, or to ensure that fisheries are in good shape and that people have food and so on. These are not single problems. They're deep networks of interconnected problems. And so in effect, to really develop a capacity to think about those kinds of things, or to essentially inform collective action, we need really good collective sense making. So, it's a bit like if I was designing a car and I would say, okay, well, I want it to be really fast. I want it to look good. I want the engine to be efficient. I want it to be made out of maybe renewable materials and so on. All of those things are great, but if the car is going in the wrong direction, it doesn't help you very much. So, in a lot of ways, there's kind of a need to identify what are all of the necessary conditions, and then what are all the sufficient conditions. So we might identify, oh, by the way, it's necessary that the car be able to be steered in a direction that we want to actually go, and that I can trust that steering mechanism, right? I mean, the worst thing you'd ever want to be is in a car that's going down the road on highway speeds and all of a sudden have the steering wheel not work. I mean, that would be horrifying, right? So in effect, there's a real sense here of trying to identify all of the necessary conditions for an adequate solution, and then also to identify what would be sufficient for that. Like, are those, once we've come up with a list of all the things that we believe are, hey, these are really important values to characterize success, are all of those things enough, right? Or would we implement that solution, then discover last minute, oh, by the way, actually, it's really important that the thing have windshield wipers, because if it doesn't and it's raining, I can't see where I'm going. So, it might be that sometimes we have problems that we can do a kind of iterative solution. We build something, kind of minimal viable product, and we deploy it, and then we discover, oh, by the way, when it's raining, you kind of want a windshield and you need windshield wipers. And you might not think about that in advance, but of course, once you try it out, you discover that kind of stuff. But in the area of existential risk, where we have some kinds of things that we don't really get to try experiments with, like, if you're developing, some sort of new weapon, for example, you use the weapon, you test the weapon, you might destroy the whole world, right? So in effect, there's a sense here of, I don't really want to do deployment tests to find out whether or not this particular kind of nano robot is going to kill all life on Earth. I only get to perform that test once because I'm part of the life that gets destroyed. So in that particular sense, now we have to think about design in a much more comprehensive way than a kind of experimental, iterative way, which has been something that business practice has been really good at. So, using technology, we kind of find ourselves needing to step back from what would ordinarily be a very evolutionary technique that's very successful, works really well. But when things are moving really fast, evolution can't necessarily keep up. And so now we have to be much more conscientious about how we think about these issues. So in that sense, ephemeral group process is my best effort attempt to come up with ways to essentially mediate, to enable the design process of this capacity of the scale for the kinds of problems for which, at this point, I don't think we really have another alternative. If you look at what the federal government is doing, or what intelligence agencies are doing, so on and so forth, they're really good at doing sense making of a specific kind of thing, particularly to deal with acute situations. But to deal with chronic problems requires a kind of different skill set and a different facility. And so in a lot of ways, when I look out into the world and I see that, we have a lot of resources for dealing with acute situations, hospitals, police, military, fire departments, all that kind of stuff. Literally everything that we have in society is very, very good for dealing with acute situations that might operate over the scale of, say, a few years. But if we're looking at things like, ecological issues or pollution or resource depletion or things that essentially are moving at the scale of decades and centuries, then the kind of choice making and sense making that we need to do around that is a somewhat different character than what we've been provisioning for so far. So in that sense, I'm trying to basically think about those kinds of issues and to develop capacities for groups of people to be able to work with those kinds of issues in a way that doesn't get us all killed, quite frankly.
So, like, you mentioned the scale of ideally like several hundred people, and we have, the local concept of, us getting together here in like, the city of San Diego or the town of Encinitas and dealing with local issues, local people that can actually come to a conference room or sit, in a gathering together. And then we have, at this point in our species and kind of our evolution, it's fairly recent that we've been able to communicate with the whole world globally with, the internet and text message and social media, and being able to, likewise create a group of 200 people on a Zoom call from, 150 different countries. And those are different elements. We have one global entity, the United Nations, that, how we, I guess when we think of implementing these systems or testing out like these group processes, I guess it's like, how do we, can we work with the United Nations to be like, who are, the people leading in renewable energy in X, Y, and Z countries, and bring those people together for a discussion. Or we can get together here in Encinitas or San Diego and have a discussion. How do you see like EGP like being implemented either at a local, really practical scale and more to like the global scale of evaluation of natural resources at a planetary scale? Like, how do you kind of see those two?
That's a very good question. So a couple things that we want to articulate very particularly is again, I was mentioning a sort of distinction from representative models.
Yeah.
There's a concept in this space called at the face. It's basically the notion of the sort of metaphor is that you've got people in a mine, you've got the whole mining company, and the people that are essentially in the ground on the kind of with the pickaxe directly against the wall are going to know more about what's actually happening than anybody upstairs in some sort of business planning capacity, right? So in other words, the people that are the most directly involved are going to, in a sense, have the best firsthand experiential knowledge of what's actually the on-the-ground truth, so to speak. So part of the emphasis on communities is to recognize that if we're really going to do good sense making, we have to have sense input, people that are directly involved in the part of the conversation. So we want, first of all, think about the kind of stakeholder model of anybody who essentially is either affecting or affected by whatever that sense making is associated with, whatever that choice making space or collective action space is going to be connected with. You really do want to have that diversity of perspectives, and you need a process that not only has that sort of sensory input of essentially enough dimensionality to be able to gain the insight. There's a need for a synthesis, so there's a conversational process that we want to think about that essentially enables the conversations that take in that sensory information through the embodiment of the people that are participating, so that when we're actually looking at issues that it's penetrating enough, it's clear enough, that we can actually start making investments about things like necessity. So there's a buy-in that happens with everybody is involved, has essentially sort of a clarity about that the process itself has made clear the insights that are informing of good design. Then it's not really a question of trying to convince them their first-hand experience, both what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis, and also how the process is working, and the insights that the process creates. So, in that particular sense, there's a real there's a real connectedness between the notion of sensory information, clarity, insight, and design before action. So in other words, when we're talking about the choice-making process, we're really thinking of it as essentially being infused with these qualities. So when we're looking at local communities, it's pretty easy to understand how to think about all that, by the people, for the people, of the people, and things like that. We get up to the level of, say, the United Nations, or just essentially a representative body like a government, for example. It gets a little trickier because then you have to sort of say, okay, well, what is the degree to which the body of people that's involved in this making process both has the sensory information and the diversity of perspectives necessary. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not making claims about whether any given body that does or does not have these characteristics. What I am saying is that in order to do good sense making, we want to ensure certain characteristics to be the case. So can it be applied at the UN level? Well, of course it can. Is it easy to see all of the dynamics that are happening at that level? Not as easily, because now you have two questions. Is the design methodology good? And is the implementation of that methodology in that context good? So if I basically have a good methodology, but I don't have good sensory information, it's going to be a kind of garbage in, garbage out situation. Whereas if I do it at a local level, then mostly I only have to think about whether the design creation methodology works. And I don't have to worry about the representative aspects so much, because there's, just by the locality fact, kind of a direct one-to-one relationship between the people that are affected and the people making the choice, just because the numbers are small enough to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
If I get up to larger scales, then things like random sortition may work better, or there may be other ways to essentially guarantee a good coupling between the diversity of insights and the sense-making inputs to the process itself, and sort of the quality of the process itself. But because I'm still thinking about these things in a somewhat earlier way than that, I'm trying to do embodied tests before trying to make too many theoretical assumptions about the skills to which this can be applied. I don't at this point know any theoretical reason or any practical reason why it couldn't be implemented at any level of what we would normally think of as governance architectures. But in this particular case, like I said, I'm mostly focusing on communities, because for a lot of reasons, really, I see it as being crucial to understand how to essentially infuse value into communities. If you look at the sort of dynamics economically and sort of social politically and so on and so forth, there are a lot of forces that will pull value into either privatization or up to the level of the state. And so smaller groups of people, such as small towns, families, extended families, and so on and so forth, a lot of those architectures have been breaking down because these forces pulling value either to the individual or to the state are very strong. So in other words, the only entities that for the most part are able to cohere are either increasingly small ones or increasingly large ones.
Yeah.
So we have a kind of atomization down to the level of the individual, and a kind of consolidation that, little companies become bigger ones, they merge and they become even bigger ones, and then eventually you have kind of a sort of interaction between, transnational corporations and national governments. And so in effect, it's this huge force. It's kind of like this overall force that's pulling things away from community level resourcing to, as I said, either individual or state level resourcing. So finding ways to essentially support the middle class and to support kind of the middle ranges of values and groups and things like that turn out to be kind of a crucial thing to basically enabling us to have a future.
So I have a couple questions around what you just said, but I'm going to check in real quick. Forrest, is your internet connection, is it looking good on your end? Because sometimes I am getting
solid at my end. I have a wire connection, so there's no possible drop on my end unless the cable gets cut, basically.
Okay, because I've got a wire connection too, so hopefully it's just because sometimes it's coming across like a little bit like robot-y. Hopefully, like the recording into the rest of the world, it's coming through.
I'm actually getting a super clean signal at this end.
Okay.
So you haven't dropped out at all. It's been crystal clear the whole time.
Okay, good. So the like, if we could play this game for a moment of, bringing this to kind of a regional level of something like renewable energy and fossil fuels in, like in Southern California. And like, for one, I guess we should make an assumption that,
Well, I'm actually trying to go to smaller scales than even that. Like I'm looking at like for a single town.
yeah,
Say a single town is trying to figure out some local issue, like do we build a stadium or not? There's a thing here of how that town makes choices around its resource management.
yes. And so right now, like, community choice aggregation is, something that has been evolving and coming through for the last, maybe, I don't know, maybe 5 years or something, which is saying, rather than, a main utility just offering a community one source of energy, however they want to source it, whether it's from fossil fuels or whatever, to community choice, like the community chooses where they get their energy. If they want to get it from a renewable resource, that they have a choice. And so, for example, I think it's Solana Beach, Carlsbad, and maybe Del Mar right now have implemented, I think, the Clean Energy Alliance. They're part of the Clean Energy Alliance. And they have been, for these last several years, working with trying to implement this community choice aggregation in these 3 communities in San Diego County. And so how could we like start to talk about implementing, utilizing EGP around like this discussion of renewable energy in San Diego County, or one of these like 3 communities, whether it's Encinitas, Del Mar, Carlsbad? Like how would we start to put together that group of 200? How would it interact with either the local government, the state government, the utilities, the organizations that are coming together to try to provide the alternatives, the difference between like individual solar production at like a household level versus a more district scale, large solar array, like ground mounted platform. Like, how could we start to explore this, like with this topic in one of these communities?
Well, you picked a fairly challenging example because it's sort of like, does the utility company locally give us an option to select this versus that? So in other words, if it's already a fairly binary choice between alternatives, the first question we got is, what is the sense that we can design something in this space? Whereas to broaden the question, and we start to say something along the lines of, okay, these communities have, because they are aware of the need for something like more energy independence, are starting to ask the question of, how can we make it so that Del Mar, Solana Beach, and Encinitas have energy independence? What does that mean? What does that look like? And so maybe the people that are part of those communities could form kind of local collectives of some sort or another to basically have this conversation. So which people are involved in the conversation in which ways and so on and so forth is a kind of question that we would want to talk about. But assuming that the notion of community of interest, right, in this case, the population of those 3 jurisdictions had a convening of some sort, right, whether it's at a conference or something like that, or we did it online, all of those questions essentially are secondary questions. It may be more conceived of a question of, how do we put together a program looking at local taxes, for example, or subsidizing people to put solar panels on their roofs, or can we do a bulk purchase and set up as kind of committee that would go house to house that would essentially do installation of equipment. So in other words, somebody might be asking, well, if we did our consolidated purchasing power, can we put together some federated power solution? Or is there a way in which we can essentially build our own solar panels? Maybe it's the case that we've come up with as a community a way to not just provision ourselves with solar for the next 20 or 30 years, whatever the lifetime of a solar panel with plastic coatings and so on and so forth. Maybe there's an interest that is long term, and is basically saying, hey, we don't want just energy independence for some block of time. We want to basically provide for energy independence in a fundamental way that is essentially ongoing, right? So what we need to do as a local community to repair hang them over a period of time, refurbish them, or make them, what would be a sustainable to do something on an energy level, or on a manufacturing level, or on a maintenance level. So, in effect, what you're wanting to do is to, first of all, transition from what would be binary choices of either or. Do we do this or not do we do this? Or do we do this or that or the other thing? To really being able to talk about this part of the options. Can we collectively increase the flexibility of our imagination so that we can imagine more items on the list? Like, it's a capacity to notice what's not on the menu, what hasn't been thought of but might actually be a very practical and viable solution, or to take two impractical solutions and do a kind of intermixing of them. Okay, we're going to take this part of this one and this part of this one and this part of this one. We're going to combine them, and the overall thing now has a capacity to be practical, whereas the two previous solutions weren't. Or to sort of look at it in the space of, okay, well, we know we have a value of not just being an energy producer, but also being able to connect to our neighbors down south in San Diego or elsewhere. That we might say, okay, we're going to take on the capacity to produce energy. We want a really good long-term relationship with you. The problem you guys are working on is water. So maybe we've got one community doing a desalinization plant, and they're thinking about the design of how to turn water that is essentially non-drinkable, non-potable into bottled water. What is the water recycling? What's the way we take it out of the ocean and then provide maybe a capacity to produce some sort of biofuel that runs a generator, and that becomes the power source. So in effect, you're taking sunlight and turning it into plant matter, and plant matter through gasification process or some other energy conversion process to be looking at the right kind of scales, more viable in the long term in 100 years. And there's a lot of design questions. And so in effect, it's like we want to, as communities, identify what's important. What are the full considerations that are involved in bringing about a holistic outcome that actually solves the financial problems. You see, the thing is that a lot of times when we think about design, we're in the space of trying. We think of it as a kind of optimization problem. Like, if you look at cell phone cameras, for example, our eyeball. The resolution of a cell phone camera is in some cases better than the resolution of our eyeballs. But on the other hand, our eyeballs have a wider range of ability to light changing conditions, can basically track motion in ways that the cameras can't. But more than that, they have this self-repairing function. If I drop my cell phone or camera, I can wait 100 years to become a camera. Where if I scratch my eyeball or something goes wrong, it'll heal. All the time it'll heal. And then you have, essentially the sort of function of the eyeball has a self-washing mechanism. It has a kind of a growing capacity. You start with a basically, and somehow or another, the eye was produced in a kind of automatic way. It's able to handle a very wide variety of temperature conditions. So in effect, there's a whole series of design characteristics that whole systems, that biosphere systems incorporate into the process that evolution has essentially compensated for in a kind of better way. That when we think about design of solutions at a community level, that we want to emulate more the nature way of doing it than, say, the hardware way of doing it. Because in a lot of cases, when we're thinking about policy, we're thinking about governance processes and so forth, we have this law of unintended consequences. We solve this problem, and then over here we discovered, oh shit, all of these side effects, all of these problems that, excuse me, no one else even knew was an issue. So, for example, there's a lot of, I'm not going to get into specific examples. There's a lot of cases where we had a pretty good idea about what the problem was that they're trying to solve. And the notion of what a complete solution looks like is actually far clearer. So we want the process of figuring out how to deal with this kind of a lot of factors than just do we do A, B, or C? That's kind of getting in the direction I'm really wanting to look at. As far as how the people are involved, well, Encinitas, Del Mar, and Solana Beach are relatively large communities. And I would think that to some extent, not everybody in those communities is going to have the time or the interest in basically these issues. But I think that for anybody who's living in those communities as an affected by these things, there's going to need to be some contact. I don't really believe that the notion here is that we set up some sort of special body of people to try to figure out something like this. It's more of a civic service kind of thing where, like going to do jury duty, you pretty much have everybody involved, mostly because that's how you ensure that the system is fair, that you don't have special interests or money or power or inequality basically driving the outcome to create more inequality, that you kind of catch that process early and also the overall choices that are actually represent the whole community as a whole.
So, I mean, I love the inquiry process and the questions of a diverse group to be like, what are the problems that we're facing? What do we want as a community? And then I also feel that we're at a point in the state of our environment and environmental issues where the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere and all, it's like sometimes a lot of us are like, wow, doesn't seem like we have a whole lot of time to address some of these issues.
That's right.
So to cut to the chase of coming up with some consent or consensus of, do most people feel that it would be beneficial to move in the direction of renewable energy? Do most people feel that it's a priority to have more local sources of healthy organic food? Several things like that. I mean, I guess to me,
either or. See, the nice thing about this, first of all, is that I wouldn't want to have to choose between healthy food and healthy water and clean air. I would like to actually have all three.
Yeah.
So in effect, there's a sense here of we don't want to prematurely make trade-offs in places where there isn't really a necessity to make trade-offs. We want adequately clean air, adequately clean water, and adequately good food. Now, when we say adequately, we're looking at actually capable of sustaining health over a fairly long period of time. But if the food is, or if the water has to be, so perfectly pure that I could basically, it would be the kind of thing that I would be living on for, say, 1,000 years. Great, but on the other hand, my life expectancy is not that long. I just needed to be clean enough for me to last 100 years. So in effect, there's a sense here of, first of all, for really important questions that are really deep stakes that affect all of us for a really long period of time. Like if you think about the sort of generational perspective of Native people, that's actually a fairly well conceived idea. There's a really good sense here of, we're not just choosing for ourselves, we're choosing for all of the people that come after us. And to be mindful of that, to think about the ethics of that, basically means that we don't want to feel the pressure of, oh my God, this needs to be decided right now, and the pressure is in effect kind of likely to choose poorly. So in effect, if the ethics of the question require us to be really, really mindful of that, to some extent I have to prioritize a little bit in favor of it being important rather than it being immediate. I want to basically be able to provide an answer to a question in a timely way. But if I've set the situation up so that I just don't have any time, then creating solutions for chronic problems is too little too late. But resources are gone, the barn door is open, you close the barn door, and then we can start to ask, okay, what were the things that we forgot to do? Like, what are all the places where we just weren't addressing chronic problems, so chronic problems became acute ones, and then we were compelled to deal with an acute one. But then, we go to thinking about things like, okay, well, now we have a subsidy from the kind of people that would normally be paying attention to chronic problems, basically being forced to deal with it on an acute situation. So that the people that essentially were taking resources or value out of the community to because they say, oh, well, there's no problems right now, there's no acute situation, so therefore I can take the fat of the land and all that stuff. And then once it becomes an acute situation, the resources aren't available to actually deal with the acute situation. So in effect, I'm not really that comfortable with the notion of saying, okay, well, we're just going to deal with it on an acute level, because that just basically sets us up for continuing series of failures. It sets up for acceleration of existential risk generators. So we find ourselves with more and more acute situations, more and more crises, because we've gotten less and less effective at dealing with chronic problems. So, on a kind of large scale whole systems approach thinking about this, it's kind of like, okay, what do we do with the acute situation to de-acute it, right? Move it back into the space being a little bit more like a chronic problem? And then how do we mediate so that it's essentially comprehensively solved so that it doesn't even show up as a chronic problem? So there's now two stages of, okay, what are the necessary and sufficient triage we need to do to move it away from the edge? And then can we, in that triage, as part of the triage, know that the triage is essentially just, it's a step, and we're going to take those steps in a way that's going to enable us to handle it at a chronic level, to enable us to basically do the necessary and sufficient for a comprehensive solution. And so in effect, I'm now going to make a deal, right? I'm going to say something along the lines of, okay, for those of you that are thinking about this on a triage level, I need a binding commitment that we're not just going to stop once the triage is done. So in other words, there's a sense here of, if we're going to solve the problem, we don't just do the first third of it, and then if you feel like too immediate a problem, what we're going to do is we're going to stop. It's like going a third of the way approach and then just quickly, you don't get to just park on the bridge. You don't have people in houses on the bridge taking their car a third of the way across and saying, oh, this is a nice view, I'm going to stay here the rest of my life. A bridge isn't really a place to do that sort of thing. A bridge is a way. So if we're going to do triage, we want to make sure that we go all the way across. So do what needs to be done to move it out of an acute situation, but make sure that the full-on momentum of dealing with that carries you through the next couple of stages of dealing with it on a chronic level and then dealing with it on a comprehensive level. So, right now when we think about these things, we think about it in terms of three scopes. We've got, will humanity survive the next 15 years? There are, I don't know, get into this stuff, but there are some concerns that things could go wrong in ways that it might kill off species in the next 15 years. This bullshit, stupid stuff. And then there is a sort of like, okay, is market process and is the current way of thinking about how to organize ourselves long-term sustainable? Well, if you look at resource usage and kind of biosphere kind of considerations and so forth, there's some real questions about that. If our world level debt is like 3.5 times our world level productivity, then at a certain point the interest rates start becoming high and we can't keep up. And there's not enough new production, new invention, new anything to essentially service the debt. And now at this particular point, you end up with a worldwide financial collapse. Well, infrastructure blows apart, right?
A good red flag that the system doesn't make sense the way it's designed.
Yeah. So in effect, you could look at existential risk, which would be kind of technology issues or wars or cosmic ray events or things like that would basically knock out life to an earlier stage, which of course from our perspective would be incomprehensibly bad. But then there would be essentially like, okay, is the system design itself stable? Can we even move in this direction for an extended period of time, or do we need to actually make it so that the overall comprehensive dynamics have endurance? And then that would be the second scope, which would be kind of like, the next 150 years. Although given the current ways in which we're burning things, 50 years out is kind of iffy. So, but then you start thinking about, okay, what is long-term conscious sustainable evolution? How do we really think well and comprehensively about whole ecosystems thriving, not just ourselves as species thriving, literally everything that we're in relation to. What does right relationship look like in a kind of really basic, complete way? Necessary and sufficient for us to essentially be very, very comfortable that, our great-grandchildren, something like 60 generations from now, are going to be really, really glad the world is the way it is. To essentially find lives that are meaningful and fulfilling, and to look up with a sense of awe into the universe, but also to look around into the eyes of their neighbors and have that same sense of awe. So, in a sense, there's a real consideration here about, what is it going to be to really create thriving, say, 1,500 years from now. So those are sort of the three scopes of consideration, and having really good vision about that last one is needing a level of care and consideration that is at this particular point hard for many people to even imagine.
Yeah.
Whereas if we're looking at, how do we deal with existential risk? Well, it turns out that's also really hard to imagine for most people. In fact, none of the three scopes are easy for people to think on. So we want to create capacities for, again, for groups of people, and I'm thinking communities in particular, but lots of them, to have a kind of gestalt effect that effectively results in really good thinking and really good implementation in these spaces. Things that are resistant to corruption, active work, that just certain embodiments at the level of practice that are really good thinking at the level of why, what, and how.
I love those three different kind of scopes and timelines to look at. The three different kind of scopes and timelines of like kind of that, like you mentioned, like maybe like 15 years, are we going to make it through this? And then like maybe 150 years, and then 1,500 years. And that, part of me right now would like to focus on that, like, are we going to make it through this next 15-year period? And our priorities. And when I was asking those questions earlier of like, whether it's, do we need renewable energy or want renewable energy? Do we want locally sourced organic food? Do we want clean water? It wasn't the thought of like one or the other. It was like, can we, I feel like, come up with a way that a community, and I guess that word is so like somewhat ambiguous, because like, as you know, I've been working on kind of eco-village development and community development around that Dunbar's number of 150 people. And so sometimes I think of like community as a community of 150 people. But then we can think, okay, the community of Encinitas, which, I don't know, is it maybe 50,000 or something like that? And so when we use the word community, like it can people can be thinking at totally different scales. Like I might be thinking of the community of San Diego. And so at like the San Diego level of several million people, if we want to cut to the chase and be like, some of us are really concerned we might not make it through the next 15-year period, we really feel like there like is a lot of interest and need to switch to renewable energy and have sources of local organic food. Then that to me right now is really where
you're presupposing a lot of things specifically, and I want to name a few of them because they matter, right?
Okay.
One of them is the notion of when we say, hey, we're worried about what happens in the next 15 years. Some of those things aren't mitigable in any individual community. So, for instance, if one of the scenarios is World War III, you might have all sorts of renewable energy, but if you happen to be on ground zero, none of that's going to help you.
Yeah.
And just to be particularly candid about this, I mean, there is enough nuclear weapons already made just to literally cover every square inch of the earth as if it was ground zero. So in other words, to glassify the entire surface of the planet, like literally every inch.
Yeah.
So, personally, I would say that any species which will go through the trouble to essentially build something like that already has a kind of collective insanity. So let's think about how to fix that first, right? But the other thing that we really want to sort of name here is that when we say the word community, there is actually a specific definition that is scale inspecific. It kind of implies a scale, as you mentioned, the Dunbar number, in the sense of, what are the number of people we can know? But the notion of community is, what are the people that we care about? And when I say care, I mean something along the lines of that I will spend some time and energy to assure their well-being. So in fact, the real way to tell whether a community is a community is to just wait until there's some situation where somebody's in trouble, somebody gets sick, or they have to move, or there's a thing that happens where there's a need to respond. And then you kind of look around and you see, well, who are the people that are showing up for that? There's a lot of stories out there about people who, had very large friend networks, and then when stuff happened, they discover who their real friends are. And a community of people is essentially a group of people that, for whatever reason, at whatever size of group, discover that they actually care about one another's welfare. And in more than just a little way, in a way that means think about what they could do to assist. And so in effect, I want to be very specific about that notion of community, because there's a lot of subtlety in that. There's a lot of real specificity in that. We talk about communities of interest. So, hey, I'm concerned about warming. Well, that's like half the population of the planet is aware of that issue. But would they personally decide they're going to do something about it for this particular individual in some other country? Well, no, it's a generic thing. It's not as obvious as that. So in a lot of ways, what we're wanting to do is to say, how do we connect values, process, and outcome? There's a deep consideration in the sense of that if the process itself has to involve community, and the outcome involves some notion of genuine health at the level of humanity, then the origin of the process, looking at where it comes from, how it works, and where it goes, is essentially talking about means ends. If the means don't support the ends, you're not going to end up with the ends that you need. And a lot of people get into this sort of this bias of just thinking about outcomes, thinking about just the objective results. Whereas part of the way in which we get there matters, and who we are going there also matters. And so in effect, I'm trying to bring out kind of a holistic approach to think about all of those things in a way that is adequate and comprehensive enough to actually achieve outcomes that are want. I mean, this isn't a question of can we discover the values. It's a question of can we be conscious enough of discovered values to the point of actually bringing them to manifestation.
And in some of the preliminary questions I asked you, what gives you hope and feel is inspirational on the planet right now, and one of your responses was the formation of communities like Tamara in Portugal.
Yeah.
And so the thoughts of, like you said, if you throw out the question of something like global warming, you can have half the planet feeling one way and half the other, with a different perspective, saying, I do believe in climate change, or I don't believe in climate change. You can have
now you're looking back at social media, how does the technology platform and so on and so forth influence, if you look at the way Facebook works as a technology, it's essentially an infrastructure that is tilting the playing field to divide people apart from one another, because the platform itself basically benefits to the degree that people are engaged with it. And the way you create engagement is to create sort of echo chamber communities. They're not communities in the real sense, because again, a virtual medium, it's actually pretty hard to, if you're connecting on Facebook, you're not in your neighbor's house, right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
in effect, there's a real sense of indirection there, but also that the platform itself is inherently polarizing. It wants people to be engaged, so it's willing to do outrage context to create divisiveness and to send everything to people that already agree, or to essentially divide people from one another by creating so strongly contrasting opinions that the common ground is almost excluded from the process of communication. So in effect, now we're going back to what is sense making as how it occurs in technology, and our current technological deployments are almost perfectly designed to be disinforming, coordinating, to essentially to divide people rather than to unify them. It's kind of gerrymandering of the mind. And so in a sense, there's a real need for us to reconceive the process of how we connect with one another. Before we can even have a notion of something like consensus or democracy or a process by which we come to a belief about something, right? The notion of belief here is actually very interesting word to pick, because to the extent there's something out there, that's what the truth is. Now, if we basically treated that there's such thing as ground truth, there's no such thing as reality, then the notion of sense making and collective choice and all the rest of that sort of stuff is already something we don't believe in. Right? Is there a ground truth to the notion that there's people actually have the capacity to choose? I think that ultimately, when we look at the notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, there's a presupposition there that individuals as sovereign beings have the capacity to make choices. And in effect, what we're now doing is to say, how do we enhance those choices? How do we make it so that those choices are actually good choices? Well, good with respect to what? If it's just a subjective notion of good, then we're never going to have the capacity to even have a conversation, because we don't even know if the English language is good, right? So in effect, somewhere along the way, there's sort of a recognition that there's a objective, there is a subjective. The objective is characterized by the nature of causation. The subjective is sort of characterized by the nature of wholeness and choice. And the relationship between them is usually characterized by change. And so if we think of reality as basically being kind of the three of those together, then now we can start to really think about this in a very comprehensive way and say, okay, what are the characteristics that allow all three of these things to be healthy, all three of these things to move in a good way? That's the kind of consideration and a level of conversation I think that ultimately we're getting to.
Well, so we have about 20 minutes left of this conversation right now, and to zero in, because similar in one of my past conversations with Susan Manowich, realizing these are big conversations that even in an hour and a half, 2 hours, you start hardly getting into the meat of something. And so in these next 20 minutes, if we could zero in on let's say we have the community of Encinitas, and maybe 50, 60,000 people. Is that approximately right? I
would guess so. I'm not entirely sure myself.
Yeah, something like that. And so then we have intentional communities or eco-villages like Tamara that, some of them could be as small as 20 people, but then some up around Dunbar's number of 100 or 200 people.
Yeah.
And so, if we take a community like Encinitas and 60,000 people, I don't know, if we were if we were to take a poll and try to figure out, do the majority of the people feel that burning fossil fuels is not a good idea in the context of our environment and the health of our community? Do people think that renewable energy is better? I don't know, what would your guess be is if we could get an accurate polling of those 60,000 people, where that might be?
I think that a lot of times people feel that their opinions about such things are fairly personal and private, and that no one else would agree with them. When we do that, people find that actually there's a large majority of people that really agree with them. But in this particular case, I think that, so for example, with fossil fuels, I don't know that anybody really cares whether their car runs on gasoline or electricity, except as far as it matters for practical things, this is intended travel. Can I basically refuel it when That means at home. So we're looking at it more from a practical point of view. And so, if you alternative that's essentially viable in the lifestyle that they're already living, and you say, hey, this particular thing for various technical reasons is bad for the environment, and this other one for other technical reasons is actually good for the environment, then people would mostly just say, well, I just want to do the right thing. But now we have to get down to discerning questions as to what's right for the environment. Now, on one hand, we can say, fossil fuels are, non-renewable. They have all of these issues with carbon and so on and so forth in the atmosphere and so on. But now we've got to go to, maybe the batteries that are used in automobiles, like with the lead acid battery, you have really good recycling. But I don't actually know what the recycling potentials are for, a lithium polymer battery. So in effect, there's a sense of, what do we mean by better solution?
Yeah.
And so and now, rather than being a binary choice, we're now looking at, can we get a real sense of what a comprehensive solution looks like in this space? And I think that everybody wants to say, yeah, I'll definitely sign on to a comprehensive solution as long as that's genuinely comprehensive, i.e. it includes my needs, it includes the needs of my neighbor, it includes the needs of the environment. That's a design question. And everybody's wanting good design. I think that for the most part, even people that are relatively obstreperous and used to just disagreeing from the point of view of devil's advocate on the basis of principle, or maybe they've got some personal motivation and benefit of one thing versus another. But largely people are genuinely good folk and do the right thing. They just have no idea what that is. And even if they did know what it is, it might not be something that they personally have optionality to do. So in fact, it's not just a question of, do people want to do the right thing? It's a question of, how do we get clear about what that is, and clear about how not, in a way that's actually practical and actionable. To bring into some specifics, because we're talking about process here. I don't think it's the kind of thing that people can really do via poll. I think it's the kind of thing that people do in having conversations like this one, i.e. small groups, say over dinner, to really solve these issues and have, a diversity of small groups that you're participating in. So, one of the things that we've learned is that if we're basically mediating most of our interactions with one another through technology, through cell phones, that there's a kind of depersonalization that is happening. Now, some elements of that are good, but there are other elements that are bad. We don't know how to communicate with each other as well. We're not playing to our strengths of the nuances of how we communicate in person. We're now basically figuring out how to type it in on a thumb keyboard, basically. And that just doesn't really have as much messaging density as what we're designed as physical beings to be able to do. So in a lot of ways, I'm looking at things like, how do we improve the process to play to our strengths? How do we shift the technology so that these kinds of conversations are actually facilitated? How do we get clear about the issues that matter so that we can start identifying things like clean air and water and the right sort of fuel to create shelters and to go visit our friends. So for example, even just suggesting, hey, that we should talk to one another. Of course, it would be preferred that we live close enough together that we can actually walk to one another's house. But given that, a lot of our friendships are essentially long distance because they were essentially bootstrapped through a technological infrastructure, it's just the internet doesn't care how what people are for the most part. There's real noticing that even the notion of community has essentially been disengaged with technology. I would love to know more of my neighbors here in Del Mar in a sense of having actual personal relationships. But in effect, I've had to sort of wait until there was this whole aerosol initiative that effectively now the community is essentially about to get, frankly, right. So the value of the natural environment and so forth has created kind of desirability to live here. And people have over a long period of time made choices to essentially create a very nice place to be, choosing trees over streets most often, and still recently. But now we have corporations saying, I can extract all that built up natural value. I can essentially do a short-term thing that's essentially going to privatize what was a considerate. And so that meeting neighbors because of this initiative, rather than because of a genuine community presence that existed prior to that, which is kind of interesting. I mean, we want to look at how do we create genuine connections at the level of community prior to a sort of assault incident as this community is currently experiencing.
Well, like in terms of the community of Dunbar and Encinitas, 60,000 people. I'm trying to like take it back again, just like focus in on something just like tangible that I can be like, okay, renewable energy, solar energy. There are like currently a lot of alliances and processes in place trying to get Del Mar and Encinitas onto renewable energy. And from a Dunbar's number, intentional community, eco-village scale to Mara process, a lot of what we're focused on here at Local Earth and Local Earth Villages, I can tangibly create and co-create a community of around 100, 150, 200 people. And we're working on some processes of like eco-village zoning right now, because a lot of the current zoning and building permits and all that aren't super conducive to that. But we can, I can find 150 other like-minded people that are interested in renewable energy, and I can build a neighborhood that either we're already all on board. So we're either doing rooftop solar or we're designing it so there's a ground mounted system in the middle of the neighborhood that, so like those steps of like action of like that 15-year periods, like that's where I've chose to focus a lot. Like, I think I can work with about 150, 200 people at a time, build, regenerative neighborhoods, communities and neighborhoods, village-like neighborhoods. But that's working with 200 people at a time rather than, 60,000 people at a time, that if we could get policy. And like right now I work with, a solar company that in San Diego, most homes, it is actually more affordable to use solar right now. Like people, I think, have it in their head that it's, a lot of times more expensive. But it's like, how do we connect with, I also would like to be impactful 60,000 people at a time rather than just 150, because I'm like those needs to me to start minimizing the burning of fossil fuels is like, I don't know if doing it 150 people at a time right now is a big enough step of like, can we do it 60,000 or 2 million people at a time? And
if you do the 150, so say, for example, rather than just having a bunch of conversations in that community and coming up with a solution, which I'm sure they will eventually, right? That all of the processes along the way were essentially made visible once that project was essentially established. So say at every step of the way that you put together that group of people and all the conversations that happened in it became part of a sort of knowledge system about that whole field of activity. So all of the things that people talked about as being issues, all the things that were brainstorms about how to solve those issues, figure out how these things connected together, the experience they had when they tried this versus when they tried that. They put that together in a package. So one package is this community, 150 people now has embodied solar, either a rooftop or a mixture of embodied stations. Maybe they learned that it was a great idea to lift them up a little bit so that you had some nice green space under it. So you put a little space between the panels, so you ended up with just the right balance of shade so that the plants that grew under that would be the kind of things that would grow in a somewhat more northern climate, maybe, that wouldn't do well with such direct sunlight. Mm-hmm. Maybe the rooftop systems are designed in such a way that they're part of water catchment, or, that there's compensation if there's a sense of really high winds or stuff like that. And then, so you have the embodied solution, but then you also have this knowledge representation of all of the process that was involved, all the considerations that went into that. Now you can take that complete body of conversation, you can just transplant it into a community that essentially made their focus figuring out how to do water sustainability, right? And so they've had this whole conversation about water sustainability and all of the issues and things associated with that. Okay, so now those two communities, they swap knowledge representations. Now they're having a conversation about solar over there, which they really don't think about. They get to say, okay, well, our situation's a little different. So when they made this assumption here, we're going to make this other assumption. And then all we have to do is just trace the impact of that to the overall conversational tree to figure out what we need to do to adapt the solution to our needs. And that's going to be a lot easier than figuring it out from scratch. But if I in the first community of basically saying, okay, now that we've got solar embodied, we need to get water neutral, right, to the point that we're regenerative with our water. We're not draining the aquifer out, and we're not going to basically run out of water because maybe the Colorado River dries up because they had a drought over there, and now all of a sudden we got to figure out how to be water sustainable. So, in effect, there's now a situation where the community that spent a lot of time thinking about how to do water regeneration can now take their conversation, which was a long, involved, careful, creative design process, and now that's a template for how this community is thinking about water. And again, we don't have to figure it out from scratch because a lot of the issues have been explored, but maybe there's some local things that need to be adapted. So we figure that out. But we can now do it because we have visibility to the assumptions that other community was making and the kind of considerations they thought of. Maybe there's something that we think of that wasn't within the design space of what they thought of. We would know that because it's part of the record.
Yeah.
Now, that works as a way to scale this broadly from 150 people to 60,000 relatively straightforwardly. The trick is to make sure that that is essentially like rightly embodied, rightly abstracted, and transferred in a way that's essentially not bound. Talking about this kind of stuff happens, studying in the back of your mind, start thinking, oh, what I'll do is I will trade this group of knowledge for that group of knowledge. Or if we can't trade it one-to-one, then I'm going to charge some money for the group that's done. So now all of a sudden everybody's thinking of it as a kind of commercial resource.
Yeah.
It's a community resource. It's a community held thing. And as soon as you try to put some sort of exchange basis on it, well, it's a virtualized thing in the first place. It was non-rivalrous to start with. But the toolkit that we have is so built on the notion of rivalness that in every single question, in every single conversation, I have to spend almost half of my time disentangling all that horseshit so that we can actually have the conversation about what it means to actually have a commons.
Yeah.
Non-rivalrous virtual resources really don't need to be structured in the same way that we think of as how we move atoms around. Bits don't work the same way as atoms. So, in the sort of triangle of thinking about infrastructure, culture, and money, culture is not for sale. And so, in effect, when we're looking at that particular thing, the community is at the culture level. It's happening over here. Conversation was in the culture. So when I'm basically helping one community with another, they're doing cultural exchange. That's not monetary exchange. And so in effect, there's a need for us to keep things that are distinct, keep the clarity, keep the purity. If it's about somebody's creative identity and they want to basically do something with that, and that's not part of the process, that's part of them. And if we're talking about community process, it needs to be held and kept at the level of community process and not just turned into something which is sold to the highest bidder or essentially stolen, as in the case of a big company trying to come in and draw value out of the community on the basis of a looks good campaign. So there's a whole dynamic here of essentially getting to a place where we're thinking about this clearly enough that our solutions are in fact obvious. Great person to think about than this. I don't know how many people in this community know about the work of Tom Atlee. He's done great thinking about how to do community process, how to think about inviting stakeholders and doing kind of democracy design and stuff like that. But again, this isn't a commercial thing. This is a civics thing, and we need to keep the civics as civics and recognize that it is that. Anyways, I'm getting a little far afield of the time, but just wanted to sort of note those bits.
Yeah. And I know like I have a 2:00, so we have just a couple more minutes. And I know the call to action you had mentioned to me was one of those could be for people to engage in the ephemeral group process and some upcoming events that are happening in the spring.
Yep.
So for any of us here in the San Diego area, Southern California area, it's pretty easy for us to participate in these.
Well, especially like, for instance, to get involved, I need to somehow signal people that that's that there's an upcoming experiment in the EGP process, or that, hey, there's a concern that this community has. I either need emails or phone numbers. So send a text message would be the preferred way to do it. But somehow or another, the call of action would be to have email and phone numbers, or phone numbers particularly, show up so that we can notify people, hey, there's an EGP event coming up next week, or we're starting a training session on how to be facilitators for that, or how to be involved in that process, that we can notify people. I don't particularly want to go through Facebook all the time. I want in a sense, develop community independent of commercial activity. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about from that respect.
Okay. And so if somebody's listening to this discussion, how can I direct them to you, to contact you? What would be the best way?
Well, I certainly would receive emails. Let me give you a phone number and an email address that we can have people write to provide us contact information.
Okay.
And then we can put that as a note at the bottom of this thing as part of the transcript or something. That might be the easiest way.
Okay. Perfect.
I don't remember off the top of my head what that email address would be, but I could certainly make that available too.
Okay. Well, we'll do that whenever you get that and send it to me. I'll make sure we put it in the information below this discussion in the text. Oh. And I'll plant this seed with you kind of, as you know, I am really focused on community development and eco-village development, and really focusing on that Dunbar's number of around 150 person community, mm-hmm. somewhere in North County, kind of North County, San Diego. And so I'm offering to share, time and energy to help bring together people for the EGP process. Soon in this spring, I'm definitely willing to commit time and energy towards bringing people together. And
great. Let's talk. That sounds great. I would certainly love to do that. So, let's just stay in touch. And again, if I know that people are interested, and again, occasionally I get people coming to me to basically say, hey, are there any communities starting up? And then I can forward them your way as well. So, there's a lot of there's a little bit of networking that we want to do just so that we can essentially stay in touch about issues in this space.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Forrest. I really appreciate this conversation and everything that you're doing.
You're welcome. You have a great day.
Blessed, brother.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Local Earth Discussion Series. If you enjoyed the information in this discussion, please share it with your friends, family, and colleagues all around the world. As mentioned earlier, we are a nonprofit organization that operates primarily on contributions from our Patreon members and donations. Please consider becoming a Local Earth Patreon member. Membership begins as low as $1 per month. This has been brought to you in partnership with the Solar Energy Alliance. There is a link in the description below for a free solar proposal for your home and information about how to become a partner or ambassador with the Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Please check out our YouTube channel or Facebook page for other discussions in the series. Wishing you a beautiful day. Aloha.